Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into a truly pivotal moment in modern history. How Fidel Castro not just came to power in Cuba, but how he really solidified his control between 1959 and 1962.
Yeah, critical period.
Absolutely. And for you, as someone studying these kinds of historical transformations, our mission in this deep dive is to really dissect the how and the why. We'll be looking specifically at his strategic use of, well, concrete policies, the undeniable application of power, pressure and fear, and his masterful command of propaganda.
Precisely. We've pored over a stack of sources detailing this period, and our aim really is to unpack how these three levers, policies, power, and propaganda were pulled, often all at once actually, to cement Castro's grip and bring about what he saw as a new order for Cuba.
Okay, let's get into it then. We'll start by maybe setting the scene a bit. 1959, understanding the Cuba Castro inherited. Then we can dive deep into those three key pillars you mentioned for his consolidation strategy.
Sounds good.
So before we jump right into the consolidation itself, let's just rewind a tiny bit. How did Castro actually ascend? Our sources talk about him becoming the repository of many disparate hopes for Cuba's regeneration by 59. What did that actually feel like for the average Cuban then? What was he representing?
It's such a potent image, isn't it?
Uh-huh.
He basically embodied this huge range of expectations. Remember, he just led this successful, very popular guerrilla campaign against Batista, who was deeply, deeply unpopular.
Right.
The sources describe his journey, that slow, triumphal way by road from Santiago to Havana, and it paints him as the last in the long line of Cuban heroes. But the key difference, and this is crucial, unlike the others, he actually survived and won.
He made it.
He made it. And this image, which was very carefully cultivated through his appearances and the media, it made him the focus point for a whole nation that was just desperate for change. Things like economic independence, especially from the U.S., better living conditions, real land redistribution, better working conditions, and importantly, accessible health and education.
Massive wish list.
Yeah. Huge. And the challenge for Castro was, okay, how do I meet all these incredibly diverse, urgent demands and, as he put it, do it in the shortest period of time?
So he arrives in Havana, basically hailed as a savior, but initially that provisional government, it had quite a few liberal figures in it, right? How did he navigate that, moving from this, well, broad coalition to becoming the undisputed leader and then immediately starting to reshape the country?
Well, once he was in power, it became pretty clear Castro wasn't just after a simple change of government. He was convinced Cuba needed a radical transformation, a new order, as he called it.
Okay.
He fundamentally believed that the pervasive U.S. influence was, at the heart of Cuba's economic and social problems.
Yeah.
So for him, just getting rid of Batista's corrupt regime, that was only step one. People wanted real improvements, and his strategy was to deliver through these bold policy changes that would completely change Cuba's relationship with the old elite and foreign powers.
That makes sense. Let's jump into that first category then. Policies. What were the immediate tangible things Castro did right away to try and fulfill those promises and, start winning over the population?
Okay, the absolute cornerstone and maybe the most significant early policy was the Agrarian Reform Act. This landed in May 1959. And look, this wasn't just shuffling some land around. It was designed as a socioeconomic earthquake.
Right.
The idea was to dismantle the old power structures in the countryside and shift the rural population's loyalty directly to him, to Castro. The act limited how much land individuals could own. It expropriated the excess land, offering bonds as compensation, though many saw that as, well, not enough.
I can imagine.
And it reorganized that land into state-run cooperatives. Crucially, it nationalized foreign-owned land, especially American-owned sugar plantations, and broke up the massive estates, aiming to make Cuba less dependent on sugar, as the sources say, and more economically sovereign. This was him directly making good on promises to the guajiros, the rural workers, from his time fighting in the mountains.
Okay, so that's the countryside. What about the cities? How did his policies reach the urban population and try to secure their backing?
Well, for the urban folks, other reforms came pretty quickly, too. There was a significant increase in wages and a reduction in rents. These were measures that, as you'd expect, generated great enthusiasm amongst the lower classes.
A direct impact.
Exactly, hitting those long-standing grievances about the cost of living. His government also slapped import taxes on luxury goods. This wasn't just about money, it was symbolic, Conserve currency, reduce reliance on imports, and try to fund this push towards industrializing and diversifying away from just sugar, that old sugar monoculture. And beyond the economy, they quickly started work on vital education and health reforms. This led to that really ambitious 1961 literacy campaign, which saw thousands of young volunteers heading out across the island to teach people to read and write. A huge undertaking.
These sound like policies designed to be very popular, particularly with the working class and the poor. But, as our sources point out, they also antagonize the middle and upper classes. What was the immediate fallout from these big changes on Cuba's social structure?
Oh, definitely.
Hmm.
While they were hugely popular with some, these changes sparked fierce resistance from others. Property owners, both Cuban and foreign, were obviously upset. And the United States, well, they saw things like the agrarian reform as outright confiscatory.
Yeah.
This huge shift also triggered a pretty significant wave of emigration. Between 1959 and 1962, something like 250,000 people left Cuba.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a big number. This included the old Batistianos, the loyalists for the previous regime, sure, but also a lot of middle-class professionals, business owners, even religious groups who were getting worried about the radical direction things were taking, the increasingly communist feel of the reforms.
So a real brain drain, too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But domestically, these same reforms allowed Castro and his allies, and especially the Popular Socialist Party, the PST, to really consolidate massive popularity among the working class and the rural poor. So much so that many Cubans, seeing these tangible benefits, they actually became, as one source puts it, less concerned about when Castro would call for elections.
Interesting. So the policies create this groundswell of support, but also this new opposition, both inside and outside Cuba, which brings us neatly to our second category, power. Beyond the sort of carrot of the policies, how did Castro use the stick, fear, pressure, force to physically lock down control and deal with opposition?
Well, given that strong opposition from the old guard, Castro's first big move using power was a systematic purge of Batista loyalists. Basically, anyone linked to the old regime's government or military.
Right.
People were rounded up, imprisoned, their properties confiscated, and put on trial. Now, the sources are clear. These trials were very quick, often criticized for not meeting basic standards of justice or offering human rights guarantees.
Summary justice, almost.
Pretty much. The justification given was blunt. The revolution was endangered by these people, and that immediate justice was more necessary than a fair trial. The outcomes: long prison sentences, sometimes execution. It sent a very, very clear message to anyone thinking of opposing the new regime.
A brutal message, really. But what about within his own revolutionary government? That initial coalition included moderates, didn't it? How did he handle potential dissent there?
That's where you really see the centralization kick in. Look, from day one, the sources suggest real authority was in the hands of Fidel Castro. Even with figures like President Manuel Urrutia and Prime Minister Jose Miro Cardona in place initially.
Figureheads, almost.
To an extent. When Prime Minister Cardona resigned quite suddenly, Castro himself just stepped right into the job. Then, President Urrutia resigned in July '59, and he was explicit about why. He opposed the increasing influence of communists in the government and Castro's refusal to hold elections. That basically cleared the decks. It allowed Castro to accelerate the reforms, pushing Cuba towards becoming a communist state by late 1961, with strong backing from the PSP.
And the PSP, the Popular Socialist Party, their influence just ballooned then. They became a key tool for this power consolidation.
Absolutely critical. The PSP methodically moved its members into senior administrative positions, especially in places like the Ministry of Labor. And crucially, they massively increased their presence in the armed forces.
Controlling the military.
Exactly. This led directly to wholesale resignation and, in some cases, arrest of anti-communist officers. By the end of 1959, the situation was stark. Anti-communism had become synonymous with counter-revolution. Dissent wasn't just disagreement anymore, it was effectively criminalized.
Wow.
And then putting Raul Castro, Fidel's brother, in charge of the Ministry of the Revolutionary Armed Forces, MINFAR, that really cemented it. It wasn't just about military strategy. It was about ensuring absolute loyalty, putting only trustworthy officers in key command positions. The revolution now had an iron fist, and Raul was wielding it.
This is where it gets really, really interesting and maybe darker. What about dissent from people who had actually fought with him? Comrades from the revolution. The sources highlight the Hubermatos case. That feels particularly significant.
Oh, the Hubermatos case is a stark illustration of Castro's ruthlessness, even against his own. Matos wasn't just anybody. He was a respected commander in the 26th of July movement, a genuine revolutionary hero.
Right.
He resigned as military chief of Camagüey province in October '59. And he was open about why. He opposed the growing communist influence and Castro's broken promise about holding elections. This was a huge potential problem for Castro.
An embarrassment, at least.
More than that, Castro feared it would trigger more dissidents from others who
Right.
maybe felt the same way, who hadn't fought for a communist state. He tried to persuade Matos to take back his resignation, failed, and then ordered his arrest.
The charge, conspiracy and treason.
Treason for resigning? Exactly. Matos was sentenced to 20 years in prison. And the sources note he endured terrible conditions, physical and psychological tortures. It was a brutal silencing of a prominent internal critic.
And then tied into this is the mystery surrounding Camilo Cienfuegos.
Yeah.
He was the one sent to arrest Matos, right? His disappearance is still debated today.
It is. Cienfuegos was another hugely popular revolutionary figure, maybe even rivaling Fidel in charisma for some people. Shortly after dealing with Matos and Camagüey, Cienfuegos' plane vanished on a flight back to Havana. His body the plane never found. The official story from the Cuban government has always been that it was a tragic accident.
But the timing.
The timing, his popularity, and the fact that some felt he might also have been uncomfortable with the sharp turn towards communism. Well, it fuels theories that Castro might have seen him as a potential threat and had him eliminated. We don't know for sure. The sources acknowledge the controversy. But the whole sequence, Matos' arrest, Cienfuegos' disappearance, it powerfully demonstrated Castro wasn't going to tolerate any challenge, perceived or real, even from his closest allies. Fear was definitely part of the toolkit.
Okay, so we've looked at the pull of policies and the push of hard power. How did Castro then weave in propaganda, our third category, to manage his image, keep people on side, and basically control the narrative during all this upheaval?
Castro was, well, a natural master of propaganda, particularly connecting directly with people. He cultivated this incredibly visible public persona. He gave almost daily speeches, often going for hours, hitting those notes of social justice, economic security, national pride.
Marathon speeches, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And he didn't just stand on balconies. He made a point of going out into the streets and traveling across the country to meet them face to face. Sources even describe him, spending an afternoon in a rural village discussing who should repair tractors or fixing refrigerators for the people.
Really getting hands-on.
It created this image of a leader who was one of them, a man of action, deeply concerned with their everyday problems. It built incredible personal loyalty.
That direct touch, that sounds incredibly effective. What else was in the propaganda playbook?
He brilliantly, and I mean brilliantly, exploited the perceived threat from the United States. This became a cornerstone of his appeal. As U.S.-Cuba relations inevitably soured because of his reforms, like the agrarian reform hitting U.S. business interests hard and run, Castro framed every bit of American opposition not as a reaction to his policies, but as an attack on Cuban sovereignty itself.
Us versus them.
Exactly. It was a classic rally around the flag strategy. He painted himself as the defender of Cuba against this giant external enemy. It tapped into a deep well of nationalism, helped unify people behind him, and crucially, it allowed him to justify crackdowns and radical measures. Any opposition could be labeled as unpatriotic, even treasonous, playing into the hands of the enemy.
Very clever. And how did he sort of institutionalize this? How did he formalize ideological control so it wasn't just reliant on his own charisma or the immediate U.S. threat?
That came through restructuring the whole political system. In 1961, all the various revolutionary groups were merged into the Integrated Revolutionary Organizations, the ORI. This was the first big step towards creating a single, unified party.
Centralizing ideology.
Precisely. This then evolved into the United Party of the Socialist Revolution of Cuba in 1962. And then finally, in 1965, it got its definitive name, the Cuban Communist Party, the PCC. And it became, quote, the only officially authorized political party in Cuba, full stop. And Castro, in his speech launching the PCC, he was very clear about its purpose. He said something like, there is only one type of revolutionary. The name of our party says, not what we were yesterday, but what we are today and what we will be tomorrow. It locked in the communist direction, no ambiguity left.
Right.
And the PCC quickly set up its infrastructure for control, its own official newspaper, grandma, youth organizations like the Young Communist League, the Jose Marti Pioneers for younger kids. This wasn't just about today. It was about building a long-term system to shape minds and ensure ideological conformity for generations.
So putting it all together, what does this picture look like? We've got these three strands, policies, power, propaganda, all working at the same time. How did they actually intertwine to cement Castro's rule so effectively in just those few years?
That synergy is really the key takeaway, isn't it? They weren't separate strategies. They reinforced each other constantly. The policies, land reform, wage increases, rent cuts, They deliver tangible benefits, especially to the poor and working class, building this genuine base of popular support. That legitimacy, that popular backing, then gave Castro the political cover, the mandate, if you like, to wield power quite ruthlessly.
Right, to crush the opposition.
Exactly. To eliminate rivals, centralize control over the military and government, arrest dissenters, the popularity gained from policies enabled the exercise of power. And then propaganda wrapped around all of it.
Okay.
Castro's charisma, the constant framing of the U.S. as an aggressor, the eventual institutionalization of the Communist Party, all of this justified both the popular policies. See, we're delivering for you against the imperialists, and the harsh use of power. We have to be strong to defend the revolution. Each element made the others more effective. It created this, well, incredibly strong, almost unbreakable grip.
And the ultimate impact of pulling all those levers together.
Well, the immediate impact was that Castro and the PSP completely consolidated their position incredibly quickly. It convinced, or perhaps compelled, many Cubans to accept this radical overhaul of their society, political, social, economic, without the elections that many had initially expected or hoped for.
Mm.
Internally, resistance was largely neutralized through that mix of coercion and ideological control.
Yeah.
But the flip side was significant emigration, that brain drain we talked about.
Yeah.
People who couldn't or wouldn't accept the new Cuba. And of course, internationally, it led to this catastrophic breakdown in relations with the United States, which really set the stage for decades of conflict and tension. Things like the Bay of Pigs invasion, the missile crisis.
Yeah.
It fundamentally shaped Cuba's path right up to the present day.
What an incredibly insightful deep dive. It's just so clear it wasn't one single thing, but this strategic and often pretty ruthless blend of policies that resonated, power that intimidated, and propaganda that persuaded and unified.
Understanding that interplay, how those elements work together, it's absolutely essential to get a handle on the complexity of his rule and why the Cuban Revolution went the way it did. He promised justice, he promised independence, and, his policies did aim at some of that. But the methods used, the power of the propaganda, they were just as important in defining what that revolution ultimately became.
So for you, the listener, maybe something to think about. How different could the Cuban story have been if Castro had maybe leaned more on one method, say, just policies and popular support, without the intense crackdown? Or what if he actually had held those early elections? How might things have played out? And looking at this deep dive, what does Castro's playbook make you think about other revolutionary leaders? Do you see parallels in how they secured power? Lots to consider there. That's all the time we have for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with more fascinating insights.